We're going to get started with this breakout session. This is a session called Looking Out, Looking In. And I am looking out. I see some of you very far back. We've got plenty of open space here at the front. So please feel free to come forward. These reserved tables are reserved for you, nobody else. So don't worry about that if you want to participate directly in the conversation. My name's Tony Pipa. I'm a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., where I spend almost all of my time focused on the extent to which federal policy can effectively support rural communities across the country in their community economic development. And that's a little bit about what our panel is going to discuss here today, is about rural communities and how they can learn from each other, not just in Vermont, but also from places in Vermont to the rest of the country. Rural America is wildly diverse. You have places that are like vast geographic distances on the public lands in the western United States. You have the historically African American communities in the American Southeast. You have native lands in the plains. You have lots of different kinds of places in the Southwest. You have where I come from in the Northeast. I'm from Northeast Central Pennsylvania, former anthracite coal country. Having said all that, I think there is a great deal that rural communities doing work to keep their communities vital and viable can learn from each other across those particular places. I document some of those stories in a podcast called Reimagine Rural, shameless promotion. Find it wherever you listen. We take the stories and we hear from local voices of places where change is happening for the better in those particular rural places. But we have a great deal of expertise on our panel today to talk about some of their research or their experience on what's happening to create progress in their rural communities. And I think the questions are, what role can Vermont play as a laboratory for rural development elsewhere? And what are Vermont's exports to that larger conversation? And how can Vermont also learn from what's happening in other places? So each of our panelists is going to come up and do a presentation on a piece of work that they've been involved in that is specifically around creating more vitality and viability in rural communities. And then once they put sort of their research or their experience on the table, we're going to engage in a conversation about how we create sort of cross connections to other communities and how that informs what you might be thinking about in your own community. So I'm going to start, we're going to start with Michael Moser, who's going to present. He'll introduce himself and his work, but he's going to present on some research and work that they've done on VERTA and rural technical assistance, and what's important to understand about the rural development infrastructure for communities in Vermont. So Michael, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Tony. Thanks, everyone. Very excited to be here. Michael Moser, I'm from the Center for Rural Studies at the University of Vermont, which is a nonprofit social science research center, and we support community and economic development in Vermont through partnerships with academics, businesses, nonprofits, and government organizations. We do research design and implementation, program evaluation, publications, and lots of good stuff with data as well. And what I'm here to talk about briefly is just this wonderful project we did last year with lots of partners across the state. I see some of them in the room today and sitting up here, as a matter of fact. The Vermont Evaluation of Rural Technical Assistance, or VERTA, as it's well known as. So the research goals of VERTA the goal was to identify the strengths and challenges of Vermont's community and economic development systems. So this was an intensive collection of stakeholder experiences, an analysis of 13 states' rural assistance systems, and Vermont stakeholder interviews with 5 other states and their representatives, and then one big convening. We conducted surveys, focus groups, interviews across the state of Vermont in the rural technical assistance system. We triangulated across all of these different stakeholder groups the findings and tried to understand what the common themes were across all of those, working with municipal representatives, regional planning and development corporation folks, state and federal agencies, philanthropic organizations, and private and nonprofit technical assistance providers. So we really tried to, collect everyone's voice, every different type of stakeholder across the systems that we have in place here. And then as we were listening to those voices and trying to understand those experiences, we also went outside of Vermont with our research and looked at 13 different states, did a sort of meta-analysis of those states and the systems that they have in place to provide technical assistance to rural communities. And in addition to that, and I think very importantly, we had our local team interacting with a subset of those those other states and interviewing those states and having conversations with those states to learn a little bit more about, what are the strengths, what are the challenges you face in providing sort of services to rural communities in your context, right? So we had that sort of interstate collaboration, interstate learning process that occurred. And then additionally, this one big convening that we had was really important, where we brought all of the stakeholders together for a session, and I'm sure some of you were there last fall, where down at Vermont State University, and we put all these people, 250 people together at tables like these, and made sure that we had diverse stakeholders at each table, and they worked through some of the ideas that were generated through the research, generated by the people that we spoke with, and iterated on those and brought forward new ideas or implementation of some of the ideas that were created. And so that's a little bit about the Verta project. Just briefly, some of the challenges and strengths that we found. These are sort of the relevant challenges and strengths that are relevant to this conversation anyway. Small communities have limited human and financial resources. We knew that, right? Vermont struggles with that. Vermont has local control. We don't have county government. We have regional planning that does very specific things. There's a lot put on our small towns, and it's mostly volunteers doing that work, or paid volunteers. And it's real challenge for our small communities to replicate that 250 plus times over and over. Resource provision can be fragmented, and each small community, rural areas are not, they're all different. Small towns are different. They have different needs and wants. Some of the strengths, though, that we found, obviously, well, maybe not so obviously, but there are caring people who are part of the communities that they serve. Like, there's caring leadership, caring people that step up and volunteer and do the hard work. There's caring people at state agencies, local municipal agencies, the federal level as well. And those folks are really important to the system. In Vermont, something that we have that's really special is 645,000 people, and so we all know each other. Like, we could play 2 degrees of separation, and we all know each other in this room somehow through that, right? And so that proximity is really important in rural situations and in Vermont particularly. And then again, small communities display strong self-advocacy in Vermont, and these are some of the strengths that are important to our system. The reason I bring those up is because they sort of parallel some of the strengths in rural research. I was thinking about, what do we export? What is the lesson in Vermont, as you mentioned, Tony? We've got highly interpersonal and qualitative research that we can do. This system, because we're so close to each other, we have access to each other, and we can really sit down with each other and learn from each other. And that's a really important function of rural research and a rural attribute that a strength that we should be pulling from. And that nature also allows us to be very inclusive of all the stakeholders in the system. And I mentioned, we spoke to stakeholders across the spectrum, and that's really a nice characteristic of rural research. And then I think our research is a little bit less hierarchical as well. So we can smooth out some of that hierarchy that may exist in other places, particularly in large population places. But the expert is your neighbor. They're not necessarily an outsider, right? The practitioner and the expert are sitting together at the table, working together. They see each other at the store, etc. And so I think these are very important sort of rural research traits as well. And finally, just so thinking about how do we bring that forward, what are some, what's the methodology to bring the strengths of what we do in Vermont and how we experience Vermont forward? I think it's really important to bring people together. A lot of what we heard from municipal officials across the state of Vermont in this research was that they wanted peer-to-peer learning, and they need to have those interactions in those networks. And I know that there's people here at UVM that are doing that. UVM Extension does a lot of that work, and I think it's really important and special. And then I think also, so communities of practice is an example. Regionalized programming and infrastructure I think is really important. I think Sarah is going to be talking about that in a couple minutes. And the ability to get people together across systems and talking to each other is really essential. And then finally, being at UVM, standing up here, I have to talk about cross-institutional research as well and programming that we can do where, whether it's 2 institutions in the state of Vermont or multiple institutions across the region of the Northeast, we can be learning from each other. It was mentioned this morning, and I think it's really essential that we continue to push out from this academy to other academies and learn from each other as much as humanly possible. And so with that, that's my sort of review of rural research in Vermont and some of the attributes and some of the things that I think we can carry forward and bring out of Vermont to other places. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep.
This isn't on. I will just say Michael set a high bar because he got it under 8 minutes. And so, and now we're going to hear from Josh Beneš on Mesonet, which is a real-time weather monitoring system, the need for that, and how this was informed actually from what's happening in other places as well. Josh?
Yeah, so thanks so much for having me here today. Today I'm going to be talking to you. I'm Josh Beneš. I'm with the Water Resources Institute here at the University of Vermont. Really focus on transcending disciplines and boundaries here at UVM to strengthen UVM's water research. And today I'm going to be talking to you about a subset of projects that I've been working on related to meteorological and snow observations across the state. And Vermont's a really complex state to be able to study weather, and because we have complex topography. There could be 10 feet of snow on top of Mount Mansfield and no snow down here in Burlington. There can be, there's these pockets of unique weather systems that come through the state. And we also have radar beam blockages that are created by our mountains that limit our view of certain areas of the state, rural areas of the state, against extreme weather events. So I'm going to be talking to you about these various projects, and I'm going to also kind of conclude with a project that kind of shows something about what we can be as an export, what we can bring to other places across the country and also the world. So the first project is our Northeast Network of Mountain Observatories. This is a project where we leverage some existing meteorological and snow monitoring infrastructure through a Cold Regions Research and Engineering Laboratory grant that has 22 weather and snow monitoring stations along an elevational gradient spanning from Lake Champlain up to Mount Mansfield and across into the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont. And there was a unique opportunity when this project came together to be able to connect with other neighboring peaks and mountain observatories in the Northeast. So we were able to secure a grant from the Environmental Protection Agency Environmental Network Fund to be able to establish this regional mountain observatory network with the Atmospheric Sciences Research Center on Whiteface Mountain, New York, and the Mount Washington Observatory. So we're able to learn from each other across state borders and also be able to start working together to ensure our data has the real-world impact and enhances meteorological predictions across our region. The next is our Northeast Snow Survey Feasibility Study, or NESS. This is a project that's funded from the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service to establish a snow monitoring network across Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine that would be similar to SNOWTEL that's out in the western states. And the western states have over 900 weather and snow monitoring stations at these higher elevation areas that really help support water supply forecasting and also flood prediction as it relates to melting snow. And we don't really have that type of network here in the Northeast. There are some stations that are in New York. That's part of the New York State Mesonet that I'll talk a little bit about later. And we also have a few of our stations through our Summit to Shore network. But there's a wonderful opportunity that we really need to fill to be able to enhance our understanding of melting snow and create better flood forecasts in our region. This is what this project is mainly focusing on. Next is our Vermont Mesonet project. With funding that we received from the Leahy Institute for Rural Partnerships, we've been catalyzing the development of a Mesonet. A Mesonet is an automated network of weather stations designed to observe weather at the mesoscale, so things like floods, thunderstorms, snow, all in real time. Our existing meteorological infrastructure in Vermont is really focused on aviation or fire safety or transportation and not really focused as much on flooding and extreme weather events. And so this is what this network is designed for. And we've been really looking heavily at WISCANet, which is a partner within the Rural Institute National Consortium that the Leahy Institute is a part of. We sent some members of our team out there to be able to learn about their infrastructure. And we also attended a community meeting last year with all of the different Mesonet networks across the country to be able to learn from them. And it's something that's really important because Vermont is actually one of 12 states in the country that doesn't have one of these networks. And we've been looking a lot at other places to be able to learn from them and understand how these networks are designed. New York is also a great example for us. They have 127 stations that are distributed across the entire state. And they established this network shortly after Hurricane Sandy struck the state back in 2012. So we really kind of need this type of infrastructure in Vermont to be able to enhance forecasts and be able to create real-time, use real-time data to be able to enhance the resilience of our state. And so the Leahy Institute was instrumental in funding this project. We started by bringing together all of these key stakeholders from the National Weather Service, State of Vermont Emergency Management and Dam Safety, Vermont State University Linden and their meteorology program, VTrans and others to be able to kind of identify where are the gaps and needs within the state. So we're really looking inward into Vermont, like what do we need here? We discussed radar beam blockages and rural communities where it's really hard to be able to create accurate forecasts. And we were also able to hire on Samantha Kohler, who's our senior meteorological technician, who brought expertise from both the New York and Maryland Mesonets. So there's another type of export where we were able to bring in personnel to be able to learn more about what we can be able to design here in Vermont. And we just established our first initial station up in Lindenville just this spring. And we had a ribbon cutting ceremony for that on May 5th. That's pictured in the background right here. So a lot of traction on this project. And lastly, kind of one example of what we can bring to other places. So we've kind of brought all of these different ideas, from kind of all of these different communities across the country to be able to learn about what we can be able to do here to enhance meteorological observation. But with Vermont being such a state with complex topography, when we kind of put together all of those different types of monitoring, we can be able to really create a structure for enhancing observations along elevational gradients. And so that's something that this Unified High Elevation Platform, or UHOP, is aiming to develop out of the Mountain Research Initiative out of Switzerland. And so I've been involved with this group of partners across countries and across the world to develop this monitoring platform. And I also presented about this at the International Mountain Conference in Innsbruck, Austria, back in September of 2025. And so we're kind of like bringing together all these puzzle pieces of different types of monitoring infrastructure. Mesonet monitoring that we really need in the valleys to be able to really support the real-time data that our communities need against flooding and extreme weather, coupled with kind of high elevation stations that observe snow and can enhance our understanding of melting snow and its impact on downstream communities. So it's exciting to see kind of all of this kind of coming together, and also a part of what we're doing here is an export of global understanding of how we can best observe mountains. And our mountains are really accessible compared to many other mountains across the world. So that is a real positive for us. So that's all that I have for my opening presentation here, and really thank you all for listening.
And just to let you know how precise Josh is, he told me his presentation was going to be 7 minutes and 45 seconds, and it was 7 minutes and 44 seconds. And so now I want to introduce Sarah Waring from the Northern Border Regional Commission to talk a little bit about, well, I mean, you're a regional commission, and so having a region that you're serving actually provides a lot of opportunity to see Vermont in context with other neighboring states.
I didn't time mine, but I promise I'm going to come in under 8 minutes. So happy to be here. Thanks so much to the Leahy Institute and to all of the partners and sponsors who helped put this together. My name is Sarah Waring. I serve as the Executive Director for the Northern Border Regional Commission. We are a 4-state, federal-state partnership. And I'm going to try to give you the basics of what we do in about 90 seconds. That's my goal for this first slide. So the commission is made up of Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and New York, and then the federal government. The commission itself is the governors of those 4 states and a federally appointed co-chair who make collaboratively decisions about investments in rural, distressed communities across our geography. So communities across those 4 states have the opportunity to apply to competitive grant programs twice a year. We also enter into partnerships and research questions and statewide or region-wide convenings. But the real goal is to direct federal investment to states' economic development priorities and to not have federal programming and federal priorities determine where funding goes, and to make sure that the distressed communities are sort of the first on the list for getting the majority of those funds and a better match rate so that they have more opportunity to come to the table and to realize their own future and their own projects. It is also baked into our DNA that the structure of the commission is a collaborative process by which we are scoring eligibility and competitiveness on the federal side, but so are the state partners. So first, we share programmatic and administrative expenses. Second, we actually build in grant administration assistance to each of our grants because often these rural communities don't have the professional or technical capacity to sort of manage federal funding, which can be quite complex. And then third, we work with each state individually to figure out what the best pathway is for project development for those rural communities and how we can source those things. And the end result are those great pictures over there on the right side of the screen. Terrific projects, terrific impacts across our 4 states. But what it does allow us to do is to take that regional perspective and take a look at how communities develop over time. So I'm going to introduce, and some of you may have seen this, I ran it out at the Southern Vermont Economy Summit a couple of weeks ago, but a conceptual framework for thinking about community development in a continuum in the same way we think about small business development. So we think about small businesses at a seed stage and then at a startup stage or a growth and maturity and transformational stage. Often when those businesses are selling on the, they're selling A to B or Series B, Series C, they're getting investors. We have in our sort of collective consciousness understood how to match capital to the right stages of small business development. And what I want to sort of lay out for you is a structural framework about how we can match capital and technical assistance to the right stages of community development. So you'll see I've put some sort of indication of when you're in a seed stage, you're doing ideation, you're working with your neighbors, you're figuring out what your priorities are. Then you may advance and you have identified a project and maybe a site, and you're going to work on childcare. Then you've figured out the capital stack, and now you're raising money and you have a project management sort of scope of work that you have to do. And then you get to the place where you have actually invested enough that you have capacity in place to do a pipeline of projects, right? And then at the far end of this scale, the community is at a place where it is an attractant for capital for things like new tax fiscal policy, and it is using its local government capacity to be able to be that capital provider in a really innovative way. So, with that framework, I want to describe two other levels of the ecosystem that we look at when we figure out where we can support or disrupt some of the barriers or some of the opportunities that exist in rural communities. The first one is this layer of rural technical assistance providers like Michael was talking about. So these are often rural development hubs. They come in many different forms. They might be the Community Foundation, they might be a CDFI, they might be a regional planning commission or a regional economic development corporation, they might be a statewide or even for-profit entity that provides really critical services at a certain point along that continuum. So everything from facilitation and grant writing and planning at the front end when a community is getting started really thinking about its future, all the way to like deal making and opportunity zone attraction at the back end, right? So there's a level of professional skill set in these rural development hubs or intermediaries that is really critical to the long-term development of rural places, because you can't often afford all of these skills at the local level, right? We don't have the tax base to do this in Vermont, or really in many of the states that we work in over and over and over again in every town. So I was imagining that the community leaders are the architects and the stewards of the vision, but then those hubs and intermediaries act as navigators and capital managers and sort of quarterbacks of the process. Then finally, look at that, Emma, it worked perfectly, thank you so much. It's like animation's a little old-fashioned, but here we go. Finally, you've got the community-minded funders, right? And the community-minded funders, ideally, are matching the right kind of capital to that stage of development. And I want to just say, one of the things that's really interesting about being on the federal funding side of things is that federal funding is one of those places. You heard Matt Dunn this morning talk about private investment and talk about philanthropy in rural places, right? Federal funding is often broadly available to rural places, but it is complex, it is reimbursement-based, and it often requires match. And what I've seen now as a federal funder for a little while is that when communities get federal funding or more complex funding at the wrong stage in their development, they can often fail because the funding isn't targeted at the right step, right? And it can sometimes prevent them from getting into that place where they can invest in themselves. All right, so let me give you a couple of examples of how we have now taken this kind of framework and this kind of thinking and tried to lean in to think about how we can scale up either the right tools or resources or models, not only out of Vermont, but also across our region. So I'm going to give you three different examples, one at a community level, one at a statewide scale, and then one at our regional scale. So we have seen there are a lot of towns in Vermont that are fewer than 5,000 people, right? We have seen how hard it is for very small towns when they lose their one general store, right? Or their one anchor employer, and how they lose not just an employer, but also a gathering place, also a meeting place, also maybe your like emergency community shelter, right? And there is a model in Vermont that we've seen be very successful, and that's a community-supported enterprise model where a nonprofit structure is enabling a risk mitigation business ownership of a general store. So this is a solution that is trying to resolve how the rural economy is broken for our smallest communities, and it is very hard to maintain a small business in those communities. So the nonprofit owns the infrastructure, manages the infrastructure, is able to solicit philanthropic donations, and the general manager of the store, or whatever the enterprise might be, could be a restaurant, whatever, only has to manage and run their own inventory and their own employees. They don't have to take on the capital expenditures for the actual infrastructure. So this shared management model has been working quite well in Vermont, and we are funding a toolkit, a handbook, that will allow us to scale this across our region so that small communities can get a pro forma and bylaws and various other tools in hand so they can do it in upstate New York and in rural New Hampshire and in Maine. The next one that I want to talk about is we have, again, in Vermont, so this is a statewide model, we have a series of local food and sustainable agriculture focused organizations. And a number of them have scaled up to the point where they are managing market-based solutions through food hub enterprises. So they might be doing distribution, they might be doing institutional sales, they might be doing food processing, but all of these require the coordination of the local farmer with the sources and the identification of those sources to the hub and then to the final marketplace. But each of them in Vermont are doing it slightly differently. And one of the challenging parts for them is that the business model is tough. It's really tough to drive trucks that last mile to those small farms and have those farmers have a livable wage and get the price that you need from the final consumer. So one of the things we were able to fund was technical assistance for that network of food hubs so that they could evaluate their own business models, figure out ways to be more efficient with their own intra-food hub distributions and sales, and ideally scale up so that Vermont produce and Vermont's sort of farm-to-plate economic development priorities could be an export. How am I doing, Tony? 1 minute. Okay, that's good. I'm on the last one. Could be an export to the rest of the East Coast and to bigger markets. Last one. This one is more of a regional scale. So Vermont obviously has a strong economic development priority. I don't know if Heather Pelham is in the room right now or not, but our outdoor recreation economy is really important to us. It is equally, if not more important, to the Adirondack State Park, to New Hampshire, and to Maine, right? All four of us have a priority baked somewhere into those state economic development plans and procedures that our outdoor rec economy is important to our small rural communities. So one of the things that we did a few years ago was host a summit. We ended up with some actionable insights and next steps. And what we're doing right now is paying for a data set and an accessible platform for community leaders at the municipal scale to access economic impact data about outdoor rec in their communities. And this is important because there is a gap in the data here. The Bureau of Labor Statistics produces a lot of these things at the state scale, but not at the county or community scale. And what that means is that a small town is at a deficit when they go to apply for funding, and they can't actually tell you how many visitors that bike path or that new placemaking effort will attract, and therefore what the economic impact might be. So that's a region-wide data set that we're going to be paying for that ideally will be done in about a year, that will then be a tool for everybody. And I'm stopping because Tony's looking at his clock. That's it. And I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks to all three of you for setting that out. So, you know, as we talk about rural communities, we love to say if you've seen one rural community, you've seen one rural community, right? Hear that a lot, diversity of rural. And Vermont can make a claim by some measures to being sort of the most rural state in the union, right? And so we've just heard multiple examples of innovation that's happening in Vermont. And I think what we want to do in this iteration of the conversation is just go a little step deeper in what does that mean? How can that be inspiring to other places? And then vice versa, how can, where are areas in which Vermont can take on some lessons through the work that you've been doing, where you see there's an opportunity for Vermont to learn some lessons from other places? So Michael, let me start with you. Vermont is unique in that it doesn't have county government. You mentioned that in your presentation. You know, as you were talking about sort of the infrastructure of local governance and the relationships of collaboration that were happening at the local level, how can that be useful to other places where there are these different layers of governance that Vermont doesn't have? What would you say to some of the things that you were thinking about that were key dimensions of that came out in your research around that infrastructure for rural development that's still going to apply even though there's going to be differences in governance that you know are very diverse across the US?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Tony. So I think, you know, Vermont has this hyper-local control thing going on where we replicate everything 250 plus times, town by town, and that has strengths and it presents challenges. But I think the strength in that, some of the strengths in that include that grassroots ability to really advocate and formulate what it is a community wants, and that self-advocacy to do that work, and self-identification of what do we want here. We feel like we're unique. We don't want to be told or given an approach that is sort of a top-down. And so I think that's one of the things that we have. We have passionate people in our communities who really care, volunteer, spend a lot of time, and they know how to advocate for what they want and what they need. And you know, we don't have the county infrastructure. We don't have sort of a lot of the top-down approaches that you might see in other places where it's more of a one-size-fits-all across a region or across an entire state or whatever it is. So I think that attribute is really important. It's the people who care. It's the grassroots nature of Vermont that has always been there. And I also think it's our leaders being willing to listen and to be, progressive and proactive, and to, take what community members are saying to them in forums like this or in the grocery store or the local community shop, and really listen and understand that and help them to attain the resources and the infrastructure to do the work that they want to do locally in their community.
And you talked about like inclusion and sort of the inclusivity part of that conversation as being important. What would be some of the lessons that other places, I mean, it's interesting, you know, because I do a lot of work with federal agencies who are running programs, and that's actually one of the challenges I think that they often feel like, how do we make sure that that people are at the table who need to be at the table and are part of this conversation? What would you say, you know, came out of the research that's sort of a key to that? Like what makes that successful?
Well, it's easy to be more inclusive when we all know each other, right? Uh-huh. And we can call in, you know, we can put a marker on our friend and ask them to bring their friend and bring the right people to the table so that we are being inclusive of lots of different voices. I think there is a lot of room for improvement here in Vermont as well. I think that like with providing infrastructure to the last mile, like reaching those most marginalized voices can be really challenging. I think there's a lot of sort of increased division, in politics right now. We know this. And so getting some people to the table can be really challenging because of the ideology that's been inserted into politics and all conversations. And so, I'm not saying that we're great at it, but I think that we have some natural characteristics that lend themselves to getting all the right people at the table, and that neighborliness goes a long way.
Yeah, the trust and the relationships was a theme that actually came out a lot in all of your presentations. Josh, let me turn to you, because as you were doing the work, you were actually drawing on a lot of work that was been done elsewhere. You showed where other regions, other states had been doing work, and so you were pulling in lessons that others had learned, and yet you had to make them specific to Vermont as well. Just reflect a little bit on how did you approach, right, taking what's already been happening, but then saying, okay, but we might have to do it a little different here. Like this might not be the exact way in which we do it. Just share a few experiences or lessons along your thinking along that.
Yeah, of course. So, for example, with our Northeast Snow Survey project, the western states have this really sophisticated snow monitoring networks, mostly on federal lands that are out there. Very easy to be able to place stations at high elevation areas on federal lands because you don't have complex land ownership types. Here in Vermont, we have a lot of private land that makes it really challenging. But then if we bring the right people together and be able to engage the local stakeholders and figure out community partners or local farms or conservation agencies that are owning lands at higher elevations, et cetera, there's a lot more opportunity. So bringing people together, like Michael has been saying, and like really kind of advocating and showing the need for this, but then kind of being able to pull from other places across the country, like out west, or in the Mesonet example, looking at Wisconsin, but then also looking at states like New York that have also complex topography like ours. And thinking about what is the most suitable type of infrastructure to be able to establish in the state. It's really important.
Yeah, we're getting a Vermont superpower here, and stakeholder engagement, and having to think about like how to bring those different stakeholders together and make it work. And Sarah, let me turn to you. You're at a regional institution now. Why is it important to take something like the community-supported enterprise model and see how it can work in other places? Like, what's even the impetus for doing something like this? Because you're having to put time, energy, and resources into doing that now. And so what's even the motivation for doing something like that and seeing how well it might work in other places?
It's a good question. I think that the motivation in general is that when we see a challenge in Vermont or in New Hampshire or in Maine that we hear about in one of the other states, it's very easy to make the argument that this is something that we should invest in, right? It's very easy to say, this is not just a one state issue, this is an issue that scales up and is at a regional sort of scale. And I think that the other thing that is important is allowing the models to have enough runtime to see what their impacts are, right? So one of the things that's been interesting to us is to watch, for example, this community-supported enterprise work has been going on for a number of years. There's a terrific organization in Vermont called the Preservation Trust of Vermont that identifies and works with the local communities specific to a building, often maintains the ownership themselves or creates a structure with the community, like a village trust sort of structure, and has a group of people who know how to do it, right? So it's not necessarily a SWAT team or a Tiger team, but they have shown that many different communities in Vermont can have success with this de-risking of the small business. And what we then see in another state is, oh, that's missing, right? And I think our opportunity as a regional funder is to be able to kind of pluck those from each state and create something that's accessible across a broader region.
Well, let's stay on the regionalization theme. Michael mentioned that Vermont has strength, sort of in acting at the hyperlocal level. That's sort of how things can be set up, and people are used to engaging that way. But we also see that there can be real strength, in connecting rural communities together at a regional level, or even sharing and developing a network that can support each other regionally. You're at a regional organization, so I'll start with you, Sarah. Like, how do you think about that? Michael, even in his presentation, talked about communities of practice, talked about different ways in which, creating networks of people. How do you think about what regionalization actually brings to rural communities, given that they are so diverse and so specific at the local level?
So I have three things that I think regionalization brings that I think are really important to focus on. One is that, again, you heard Matt Dunn this morning talk about how much philanthropic investment and how much private capital comes to rural America. One of the things that regionalization does is to scale up a solution so that our bigger funders are interested in us, period. They see us when we are bigger in scale. They do not see one small town doing one placemaking effort. They see placemaking as a strategy for economic development, and they say, great, let's invest in all of Vermont to do that with $1 million, right, or whatever. But the example is national philanthropy, and private investment and equity capital doesn't come to us unless we're visible to them. So it makes us visible. The other thing that it can do that we've seen across all 4 of our state governments is that it can change the way our state government invests, the way our legislature gets involved, and the way that we then structure our services through state government for those rural communities. So a quick example again for us is in the outdoor rec space. We support each of our states with capacity money that allows them to fund outdoor recreation through small grants through their state offices of outdoor rec. They wouldn't really have been able to do that without our resources flowing through them, but now they all have those state offices of outdoor rec, right? And I think the third thing that regionalization does that is really important to just like remember is that ideally it will enable a small place not to have to do everything by itself. And that's like that rural capacity challenge. There's this, I like to call it the STP syndrome, right? The same 2 people syndrome in every small town doing all the jobs. And if we can reduce the STP syndrome for our small communities, and Beth was in the room, I think in DC when we were talking about that, and enable those rural hubs to do more of it, then our lives are a little easier at the local level.
Yeah, I love that. So Michael, let me turn to you and ask a little bit of the same version of that same question. What, from the research that you were doing, at least at a regional level and even beyond, you were learning from some other states as well. What do you think that can bring to the learning aspect of this? Where does the university and the research intersect with that? And how can leadership even be thinking about making sure that you're building those sorts of connections to both across places as well as even to other places, other states?
Sure, yeah. So 2 things. Our towns are too small to do everything on their own. I think that's what Sarah was saying. I think we understand that. We're relying on volunteers here in the state of Vermont, paid volunteers. It's really it's inefficient. And when we listen to a lot of the voices of stakeholders across the state of Vermont, municipal officials, they wanted to learn from each other, but they also wanted to help each other and form together to share resources, whether it's a grader for the road, which costs, I don't know, $250,000 or whatever it is, or sharing, like an accountant or, zoning administrator, for example. And so there's this hyper-regionalization, which might work for Vermont because we already do everything at the hyper-local level. So why not enable a few towns that are connected by economic ties, connected by geographic ties, social ties, to work together and to find solutions that work for them together. And we have that example in some of I think our regional planning commissions are quite large, but we do have the Mad River Valley Planning District, which is a 3-town planning district that is self-described, self-determined, and there are other examples as well where towns are beginning to share resources and work together, and I think that's really important from a small regional perspective. Now, on the larger regional perspective, I think, like you asked about institutions in the academy, university here, I think we should absolutely be doing more of that, as much as we can, learning from other rural communities and other places, and submitting proposals together that look at how things are done in one place and take those lessons and bring them forward to another place like Vermont or vice versa. I'll make a shameless plug. We're going to put together a proposal for the Leahy Institute for next year to do some work, cross-collaboration between West Virginia and Vermont, which is really interesting, around rural tourism-based economic development. And they've been doing a lot of that work in places where there's no history of that. And it's like in our blood here in Vermont. And I think there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from each other because the situations are different, the people are different, the cultures are different, everything's different. And by forcing ourselves to sort of like come together and learn about those differences, we may pick out some very important lessons from each other.
That's super helpful. And Josh, in the scientific community, maybe you have a little bit of an advantage just because of the way in which, a particular discipline or a particular problem, can be coming at it from lots of different places. But I mean, it sounds like even with the Mesonet, you started with a partnership with, the university partnership here at Vermont and the university partnership in Wisconsin. But what is it, you talked about even being overseas and providing what's happening in Vermont to an international audience. How does that work? How do we make sure we keep doing that? And what do you gain from that, even by giving, by being out there internationally?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity when, I think kind of building off of what the discussion was at the regional level as well, kind of connecting the infrastructure we already established here at UVM at this regional perspective with other mountain peaks really kind of amplified the value of our network. And so we were kind of greater than the sum of our parts by like bringing together these different mountain peaks. And then bringing that to the international community and kind of showing how we're trying to work to standardize our observations. We can also learn from them as well at this international level and also make sure that the data that we're producing is kind of relevant for kind of international monitoring, around how climate is changing around these high elevation areas across the world. And then we can be able to bring that information back home here to Vermont and be able to think about how we can best design our infrastructure and be able to learn from that international community to be able to kind of guide research and understanding of these unique places. And so, being able to kind of view other places like Wisconsin and designing the Mesonet or Western states and how they're designing their snow observation networks is really kind of like allowing us to be able to put together all of this kind of key monitoring that works for our rural communities in these rural areas, especially here in Vermont, and then also kind of make that relevant for rural communities across the world.
Yeah, thank you. So what questions, comments, reactions from the audience do we have for the last 10 minutes? I'd like to involve you in this conversation. Anyone? We've got someone right here in the middle. We've got a mic coming your way. And just introduce yourself as you introduce your question.
Hi, my name's Claire Whitehouse. I'm a colleague of Michael's at the Center for Rural Studies. I feel like, in Vermont, our dreams are so big, our networks are so strong, and often it feels like we have the ideas and the will to do big projects, but we don't necessarily have the capital. Right? I think a clear example of that is universal health care, which we passed but didn't fund, right? So, I think like maybe to Michael and Joshua, like what are sort of the big issues for which we have the will and lack the capital? And for Sarah, how do we get that capital? Right? Like what
Sarah's
do we,
the money bags.
Yeah.
Who wants to go first?
I guess I can start. I always sometimes when I say that Vermont's one of the 12 states in the country that currently doesn't have a Mesonet, some people are like kind of surprised by that because like, isn't Vermont supposed to be leading the way on all these different initiatives and things? And like, why don't we have this infrastructure yet compared to all these other states? And I think because we're at such a smaller scale compared to a lot of other states, like that New York was able to really mobilize and put together like 127 stations and be able to like standardize this across a whole region. I think sometimes it's harder to kind of put those pieces together and also be able to kind of establish places in monitoring infrastructure in places that are so heavily forested as well. And so kind of being able to kind of focus on how to be able to pull from examples from other places and be able to kind of build into this regional framework is incredibly important.
Michael, do you want to comment?
Yeah, maybe I'll put a challenge out to the room anyway. Like, I'm incredibly lucky to have been funded to do work by the Leahy Institute, and many of us in this room are funded to do work all the time. And how much of that work is actually directly applied to stakeholder communities in Vermont? So like that's, we have resources, we have access to those resources. They might be small, we may be a small population, but are we turning those resources right to the communities, or are we doing stuff that's sort of like, who said navel gazing earlier? Was that Becca Ballant? Yeah, so like we'd want to avoid that at the institutional level, right? And we want to make sure that the funding that we bring in is actually serving our communities, and UVM's really pushing that, and it's lovely to be a part of that right now.
And I can answer really briefly. It's a great question. For me, there are two things that I think would accelerate our ability across, again, all 4 of our states, but let's say Vermont in particular, to attract more capital. One thing that we are missing is a pooled investment mechanism. There are examples in other rural places. Invest Appalachia is a great example. There are multi-state investment platforms where what the intermediary does literally is attract equity investors, angel investors, et cetera, to then be dispersed among many smaller deals, and the intermediary does those smaller deals. So that is something we need. We have mechanisms like impact investing at the Vermont Community Foundation. We have CDFIs that are doing some of this work, but again, scaling it is something that would be really important. And then I think the other thing that's important to mention, and Josh, your example is probably perfect to illustrate this. Vermont's state budget is about $8 billion. The state of New York is $285 billion, right? So the difference in what the state can leverage as a capital provider is a really critical element of how we bring more capital in, and the risks we are willing to take in the state government investment side, given our limited resources, is I think something that should be considered.
So I'll take moderator's privilege and jump in as well with 2 points. One, having been a former funder, I just want to go back to Sarah's point that she made on sort of regionalization and bringing together and aggregating things that are happening up at the local level as a way to leverage interest, allow funders to make big bets by seeing lots of small bets that are linked together. But I would also say, as someone who lives in Washington, D.C. and spends a lot of my time thinking about policy, that looking out and creating connections both within the state but then outside the state is a way for policy change to happen. And that's a way for policies to then start to react to some of the bigger issues that might be creating the environment in which towns are actually operating. I know we had a hand up over here as well.
Hello, Mark Allard, U.S. Food and Drug Administration. And my question is about you're collecting data. And so the question is, what's your data sharing plan? Now, I know the weather, usually that's shared internationally for free. It's put in public databases. We'll get an answer from Joshua. I'm a big fan of you can get paid for sharing your data. That's part of the deal usually. But I'm interested because there was talk about saving the special Vermont data and not sharing it, leveraging it. So I'm curious, on the panel, where is your position and how do you see this? Great
question, especially because data can be such a challenge for measuring rural. Michael, do you want to jump in first?
Yes, Emma will. She's boring a hole through my brain right now looking at it. So we're working on this project right now to develop a dashboard of Vermont-centric data, and I think what's really unique about this, well, there's several things that are unique about this, but one of the things that is unique is that it's not just like the federal census data, or repackaging that, or CDC data, or wherever the, whatever the data sets are. But our goal is to collect data that's produced here at the university, data that's collected by municipalities, data that's collected through extension activities, and to bring all of those data sets together in one place so that we can democratize that data and make it accessible. And this is the other piece, make it accessible to people to really dig in a little bit and look at disparate types of data beside each other, which I think is really unique and interesting, and enable new analyses of problems with all these different data to sort of see if there's something there that we haven't seen before. And that's part of visualization and analysis and having all the data in one space. And so I think that's something that we're doing here through this institution to bring the data back to communities and support community economic development.
Josh, how does that work from your perspective?
Yeah, we've been kind of as we've been working to now kind of have a vision for building out a mesonet across Vermont, this is something that we've been thinking a lot about. New York charges, for its data for kind of private companies that may profit off of its data. And so we haven't developed a full strategy yet. We know we want to be able to make our data free and openly accessible to everyone that needs it to be able to keep our community safe. And we're completely committed to that. But in terms of for-profit entities that could use our data, we are still in kind of self-reflection mode. So if anybody has feedback or ideas on that, I'd love to be able to talk to you afterwards.
And Sarah, at Northern Border, you're going to be an important collector and purveyor of data, so we'd love to hear how you're thinking about that.
Yeah, so the quick example is the outdoor recreation data set that I was talking about earlier. That one will be publicly available. Projects like that, when we are paying for the product, will be shared and publicly available and hopefully really accessible for the community leader to use, right? So that's a part of what we're trying to do, is center that skill set of the rural local leader so that they can access the data. And that's a big part of what we do. I will just share one other thing since I've got the mic. One of the things that was really frustrating to me, I had a chance to work for USDA Rural Development before this job, and federal agencies are not allowed to share information about the applicants to their grant or loan programs with other entities, with other federal agencies, with philanthropy, unless given permission by the grantee or applicant to do so. Which seems like a really easy problem to solve if you put a checkbox on the application and say, do you give me permission to share? So we did that this year for the first time. And one of the things we're excited about in terms of data sharing, right, is to say to our philanthropic partners in every state that we work in, here's our pipeline of projects. Which ones do you want to match, right? To say to the EDA, here's who's coming in the door that's connected to the disaster funding that you have open right now. To say to rural development, et cetera, et cetera. So there are solutions to be able to coordinate around data and around need that I think can be enabled by funders.
Well, I want to thank each of you for participating and being in this conversation. As Kirk mentioned, I've been to RISE before as a keynote, and I've come back to be part of this. And one of the reasons why is because there's so much happening in Vermont that I think can be applied to other places. So I think this idea of looking out and looking in is actually a really important idea. It's an important idea not just for the health and vitality of rural communities in Vermont, but also across the nation. And I want to thank each of you for participating in this conversation. And thanks, Emma, for having me.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you all so much for joining us for this session. It's lunchtime. We are serving lunch on the first floor of the Davis Center. So you can take the stairs, or there are student ambassadors that have a dark green thing on their name tag, and they will show you where the elevator is. We are doing all of our lunch in UVM EcoWare containers, so take your lunch to go and then come back up here because we're doing 3 lunch and learn sessions. We're trying to pack as much into today as we possibly can. All the information about those is in your agenda. And then don't forget to come back here for our afternoon component of this track, where Tony is going to be leading a discussion in line with his work on America's Rural Future Commission. So you'll have the opportunity to lend your voice as a Vermonter to a federal conversation about what we can do for rural America. Cool? Okay. See you then.